Welcome, Westminster residents, to this panel discussion by a group of Westminster writers about the craft of writing fiction. If writing fiction is something that you wanted to do but aren't exactly sure where to start, we hope to be of help and perhaps demystify the process. If you already write fiction, this may be familiar, but maybe you'll hear something new or different, and we hope helpful. First, let me introduce our panel. There is Janice Scheffelman. Janice is an author of award-winning books. She grew up in a university neighborhood in Dallas, where her professor father read to her from an early age, and she began a love affair with books, which led to a career as a teacher, a librarian, traveler, and writer. Hello, Janice.
Hello.
Nice to see you. And then we have Carol Sykes. Hello, Carol.
Hello.
Carol is a native of, went to school in Austin, did graduate study at Columbia University Teachers College in New York City. She's well known as a painter, and she taught in the San Antonio Public Schools and the Austin Museum of Art, School of Art. She's represented in Archives of Women of the Southwest, and has exhibited in group shows and solo shows. But her published books are Fairy Tales Are Real, Hudson Bend, and the Birth of Lake Travis. So glad to have you with us, Carol. And then Jim Simons. Hi, Jim.
Hi.
Jim is a graduate of the University of Texas Law School in 1965. That makes me feel old. Jim worked for the Office of Economic Opportunity, the Federal War on Poverty Agency in his heyday. And then he opened a private practice in Austin representing many activists of the New Left. He was a trial lawyer in Texas for nearly 4 decades, handling many cases involving civil rights and other trial practices. And my name is Boyd Taylor. All 4 of us are represented by works of fiction in both the spring 2020 and the fall 2020 edition of the Westminster Writers Journal. So let's get started. Carol, I should say that Jim and Carol and I wrote short stories for the Writers Journal, and Janice has favored us with 2 installments from her novel Village Without Men. So let's dive right in. Why do we do it? Some people think of some people limit their reading to nonfiction, and they think of fiction as escapism. So let's start with you, Janice. Why do you write fiction?
Well, it is escapism, and we all need to escape, but it's more than escape. But there's several reasons that I write fiction. I guess the most important one is that I feel a real passion to make the past come alive. William Faulkner said, the past is not dead, it's not even past. And so my very first book, A Paradise Called Texas, was my attempt to make my German ancestors' immigration to the hill country of Texas, to make it come alive. My father had written a history of their immigration, but I wanted it more alive than that, with dialogue and characters you could relate to. But that's my driving passion. Then I have a more frivolous reason, and it's called Esprit d'Escalier, and that's French for wit from the staircase. And it means you go to a party and you're in conversations, and after you leave and you're going down the stairs, you think of the perfect reply to something somebody said, but it's too late. So I find that writing fiction, I have the time to sit there and think of the perfect reply. And here's an example. In my book for young readers, A Mare for Young Wolf, the boy, young wolf, is being bullied by some of the boys in his village and teasing him because he chose a mare for his horse. And mares were for women and little children, according to Comanche culture. And so at one scene, he's bucked off the horse and all the boys are making fun of him. And as he's lying on the ground, what does he say? Well, I can't have him curse. This is a book for young readers. So what could he say? And then it came to me. He says, "Oh, buffalo chips." So that's my other reason I can think of the right thing to say.
Very positive. Yeah, well, thank you. So Jim, why do you write fiction?
I think I have to give you a disclaimer before we get too far along. I've never had any fiction published, and
Well, you've had 2 short stories published.
counting the Westminster Journal.
That's right.
And I'm grateful that it published a couple of things that I wrote. I wrote them both back in the 60s, to tell you the truth. I do still write sometimes, but I've never, of course, followed fiction writing as a career. I practiced law for 40 years and I didn't have time to write. Now that I do, I don't do as much writing as I would like to, but I'm hoping that will change. The instinct for writing fiction, or I suppose anything, is something difficult to trace, but for me, I think it goes back to the 7th grade. I had a wonderful English teacher. Teachers are great, I might say. My daughter's one of them. But I had a teacher in the 7th grade who encouraged me, upon reading some of the material that she asked us to write. And that was the first idea that I had that anyone thought I might be able to write anything that would be interesting or well done. She was quite useful and encouraging. Later on at Adamson High School in Dallas, I had another English teacher who was the same kind of encouraging influence in my life. She liked what I wrote. She encouraged it. She even went into she even devoted some of the assignments to what I would call creative writing. I think that's a little bit unusual. At SMU, I had a English professor who was very good too, Lawrence Perrine, who is well known as a teacher and poet, I guess.
Mhm.
But I think that's what got me started. The first actual pieces that I produced were probably after college, but before law practice, perhaps, and before even law school in some instances. And these pieces that I wrote in that period, I stuck in a file, and I've moved around a lot since then. I don't know where they went, how far they've come, but lo and behold, they did appear when we moved over here to Westminster. So
That's one virtue of downsizing.
right, and it's just pure luck because I didn't know where they were.
Well, we'll talk about your one of your stories here in a minute, I hope. Carol, what's your answer to this question? Why do we write fiction?
I write fiction because it's just a lot of fun. And by the time you get it to be as old as we are, you need to look for a lot of fun around. And I also enjoy research, and I write for the in-house Banner stories about Texas history. So that's fun also. But there are opportunities in fiction to really be creative and to be inventive and to have a lot of fun. I think that and I have you all have, some of you have heard me say everybody has a story, and this is true. And if one has a story which they're reticent about writing about, then make it fiction. You can take a story, or you can take a dream you had, or there all kinds of opportunities. And I think if we could encourage more people not to be timid about writing, but to just as you said earlier, Boyd, to start writing. And the reason, so specifically the reason why I write fiction is because I enjoy it a great deal.
Well, that's a good reason, and it shows through, I think, in your work. So to me, storytelling is as old as mankind, and the myths and stories that were passed down in the oral tradition were used for a purpose. They were used to teach people about the things that they didn't understand. And so I think to me, fiction has a couple of purposes. In addition to being something that I really enjoy doing, it allows me to try to figure out what I think about certain things. And in the process of having characters face certain issues or questions, I learn something about myself at the same time that I'm developing that story. And the other thing is, I think it allows people, the reader, you hope to connect with a reader who will go to places and think about things and experience the situations that your imagination has created that they wouldn't otherwise experience or go to. So I feel like that you simply set out to tell a good story, and you hope that it speaks to people, no matter who they are or where they live. So your object is, in my case, I think, is that self-satisfaction we get from, and self-awareness and knowledge we get from exploring different places and situations in fiction writing, and then the hope that the reader has some shares in some of that experience. So. So let's move on a little bit then. How do you develop? I skipped a question, I think, didn't I? So where do your story ideas come from? Yeah, that's. You've said I think that you said, Janice, that your stories, you like historical. You like to explore the history, particularly the history of a certain section of Texas at a certain time, because you had strong family associations with that. So that formed the basis for some of your stories and your children's books. Where do your stories come from?
Well, yes, stories come from everywhere. They come from research. They come from travel. They come from a newspaper story. They might even come from neighbors or even music. I have a book that's come from each one of those. As far as neighbors go, Tom and I used to live in a neighborhood where there were descendants of Lebanese immigrants, and there are many Lebanese descendants in Austin, actually. And it seems to me that they're all very successful. So I began to wonder, why is it? Why are all of these Lebanese immigrants and their descendants so successful? And it's because they work hard and they follow their dreams. So from that experience, I wrote A Peddler's Dream, which is a picture book about a young Lebanese man who comes to Texas to seek his fortune, and follows his dream. So, and one that came from music is Vivaldi. I love Vivaldi's music, and I began to wonder what sort of man he was and where did he live, and that became Vivaldi. So ideas are everywhere. You just have to be alert and look for them.
Yeah, I think that's true. I've found certain situations and people, situations that friends or acquaintances found themselves in that stayed with me over the years and formed the basis for a story, not particularly about them, but about the situation in which they found themselves.
Uh-huh.
And I mean, we have to write what we know. We have to write about things that we have experienced or that we can relate to, the experiences of others. It's not something that you just pick out of the air. And I mean, I don't get inspiration that way. Carol gets inspiration from her dreams. I know that one of your stories, that the story in the spring edition, was that the one that was based on a dream?
Yes, it was. And also pretty much the one in the fall edition. And that's really just a way to start. And what happens, what I find, Janice says she finds it in history. I find I can, in dreams, can find a beginning, and then it's like painting, which I am really a painter rather than a writer, and I always enjoyed painting from nature. But at some point, the painting would have a life of its own, and I would simply go with it. And I think the same thing happens in writing, or can happen in writing. It does for me. And so if I have a nut to crack, somewhere to start, then then I can be as creative as I want to with fiction and go, just follow the lead. And but dreams are one source for me. And also, at one point in time, in our time, we had, my husband and I had did some counseling with a Baptist minister who had gone, who had become a counselor, and it was very provocative. And I really wrote basically all of that first book as a result of that. And it was that I was seeing my family, Janice, I was seeing them in a much deeper and more interesting way. I was seeing them psychologically, but since it was my family, I had to make it fiction. And so,
Yeah.
they became fairy tales real. And boy, one more thing, you mentioned the fact that our ancestors and early peoples used myths and so forth to teach. And the Kachina dolls in New Mexico, where we love to go, are used exactly for that purpose. they make these wonderful dolls, and then they tell these stories, which I'm sure are part fiction, but also part. But it is it's a way to learn. It's a way to teach, and
Yeah.
so I'm getting off of the question, which was.
Where do you
Sorry,
find your
Where do your
ideas?
ideas come from?
Yeah, sorry. So various places, and mostly out of my head.
Could I say something about what
Yeah,
Boyd said? You said, write what you know, and that is an age-old advice to writers, but I have a problem with it because some people think that means you can only write from your own experience, but no, if you're passionate about something, you can read, you can learn, you can find out, and you can know more than you knew before.
yeah. Well, that's absolutely true. I really, because, you know, and I write in my books that I have, that I've written, there's a lot in there that I had to learn about. It wasn't something that I just woke up and said, well, I'm going to write about what happened in, you know, 20 years ago, and it comes out.
Yeah.
It doesn't work that way, but it gives you there is a need to have some familiarity and knowledge about the subject you're writing about.
Right. And I would never write about a place I haven't been and
Yeah.
absorbed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's true. Yeah.
So Jim, your story about South Beach was based on a very specific place and time. So I'm assuming, tell me how much of your own experience was in that, is reflected in that story.
It was North Beach, by the way.
I'm sorry, North Beach. Yeah.
I think basically the whole story was a product of my imagination. I can't think of anything that produced it. I mean, that caused me to write it, other than my first visit to that particular area of Corpus Christi, and my sense, or at least projection, imagination of what could have happened there, and the fact that it could have triggered nostalgia. And that's really what the story's about.
But it has a real sense of place and time.
And I
And,
must say, it's not historically accurate, probably. I've never checked it, but I didn't intend it to be that way. I intended it to be just a product of my imagination.
So if you have a if you have a story that you think needs telling, it obviously has to have a protagonist, some kind of characters in it. How do you go about developing a character, Janice? How do you decide who's going to take the lead in your work, and how do you flesh out that person?
Well, it's a long process. The person I know best is me. And so there's something of me in every character, but I also bring in friends or just people I observe. I'm always observing people. And slowly, as I write and I put my characters through difficulties, I get to know them better. So it doesn't all come at once. I learn about them and actually learn to love them. In fact, some of my characters, especially the young ones, seem like my own children. So it's a slow process.
I agree with you. I found that I can have a sense of what a person's going to do and what he's going to be like when I start writing about him and put him. But when I put him in different situations in the story, he surprises me sometimes and does things that I hadn't really expected him to do. And so I think I could never sit down and write ahead of time a complete biography and background and backstory of a person and expect it to stay that way through the as the story evolved. Yeah.
I agree. Yeah.
Well, I think a great way to create a character is through dialogue.
Yes.
And I did this in, I guess, to an extreme in this last, the fall issue story, which the narrator, I dropped the E's on his, when he would say driving, he would say driving, and he would say swimming. And so I have a really good friend who's a wonderful writer, and I asked him to read this, and he, interestingly, he said, well, it has a good flow and I like the rhythm, but he said, I think you should drop out that ending business. Well, this guy was educated in England, and he just speaks beautifully. And so I listened to him, and I didn't say anything, and I thought about it, and I thought, no, this guy, there was a purpose in my making this guy sound a little bit not educated and not enunciating his words properly. So I didn't follow my friend's lead. Maybe I should have, but I don't know. It seemed right to me. So you, as Janice says, and Boyd both, that you do, you get to know them when you start writing these fictitious characters. The more you know them, the more you feel like that's right. That's the way they are.
Yeah. The other thing I found is that I don't need to describe the person in great detail physically. I usually, a lot of times, I have in mind a model or a person I knew. I have in mind a person that this character is going to look something like or behave something like. But the less I say about him in terms of his physical characteristics, I think the more the reader's imagination is engaged, so that the reader can supply a lot of the physical characteristics of that person, and I don't have to do that. And if I've been reading some old detective stories by Eric Ambler, who was sort of the founder of the British detective story schools between World War I and World War II. And I love his stories, and his plots and his characters are interesting, but he has a very peculiar habit of describing in great detail the face and the ears and the mouth and of the character. It bothers me because I find I have to stop and try to visualize what it was he was talking about. Whereas if he had simply given me enough to work on, my imagination could supply the rest. So I think in characters, it's not necessary for us to have them come fully realized on the page.
But
Well,
I think
that leads to
that
your
is
question about show but don't tell. Don't leave a little bit to your reader's discretion and yeah.
I'd say, Jim, in your story on is it North Beach or South Beach? North Beach. You don't describe the narrator at all, but I have a very clear view of what I think he ought to look like, so I believe that's a good process to follow. Janice, did you want to say something about that?
what did I think that just maybe one or two features that are outstanding or enough to build on. But I do think that during the course of a novel, at least, you have to keep reminding the reader of these features,
Mhm.
because they'll forget. You have a lot of characters with a lot of different features. And I've studied novels, and I know it's hard to keep it going and keep that person in view.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. So shifting gears a little bit, do you all write from outlines, or do you just write a first sentence and let it go from there? How do you deal with the structure of the story before you start writing?
What you just said. What you just said is what I
You
said.
write the first sentence and let it go, huh?
Exactly. I have never, ever been able to sit down and write an outline of any kind of creative writing that I attempted to do. I don't even use outlines much for legal writing or other kinds of communication. I
Well,
don't know.
I found it myself in writing longer fiction that it's essential for me to have some sense of where the story is going to go.
You have to
I know how
remember-
it's going to start and I know how it's going to end, and I can tell myself how it's going to develop. Maybe there's some critical things that happen in the course of the story. So I have an outline, but I don't stick closely to it. I have to revise the outline as the manuscript develops. I don't know. How do you work, Janice?
I think this is something that every writer has to decide for himself or herself. I know that there are writers who start with characters, start a story and say that they let the characters tell them where it's going. But for me, in a novel, that could mean a lot of rewriting and going down the wrong road. Whereas if you have an outline, a flexible outline, you can proceed. But I think you have to know the ending. And I'm working on a screenplay now, and all the books I've read about writing a screenplay is you have to know the beginning and you have to know the ending positively.
Story needs an arc.
Well, I think that, writing a novel, it would be necessary, but a short story, and that's all I've ever done. I've had an idea about where it's going, but sometimes it has its mind of its own. And I think one time I really did try to make an outline and I just tossed it very rapidly. But with a novel, I certainly can understand how you would need to. But talking about the ending of a story, the first story that I wrote for the Westminster Journal, really many people were very concerned and disrupted and curious about the ending. But the purpose of that ending was this was called the khaki pants and a lady in a fur coat.
Oh, I wanted to talk to you about that ending. Yeah.
Yes, you did. Boyd came right away to talk about it. And the thing about that ending is that it could have ended so many different ways that I couldn't choose the right ending. And so, as a matter of fact, I left it as a big question mark in hopes that people would. I mean, the woman in the fur coat could have been this protagonist's mother, could have been his girlfriend.
Yeah, I like that. I like that one better. I like that girlfriend ending better.
You like that one better, okay?
Well,
Well,
I always say we need to use your imagination and let the reader fill in the gaps. But
Exactly.
Well, there are a lot of different ways that people like to write. Some write on paper, first draft, some write on computer, first draft. Do it whatever works for you. But there are techniques to be learned for sure. And my Bible is The Art of Fiction by John Gardner. And if you know the rules, you can break them. But if you don't know the rules, you can't.
that's right. And is that in the is that book in the library? The Art of Fiction? Do you know?
I don't know. It's on my shelf, but you can't
Yeah.
have it.
Well, I've read it. We need to speak to Helen.
Yeah,
about
that's
having
right.
it-
We
having it
should.
in the library. Yeah.
We should have it.
Well, I, for one, don't really want to read it. It sounds very inhibiting.
No, it's not. It's not inhibiting it. But they're just like playing the piano. There are techniques you have to learn.
That's right.
And one of
Like
them
a
is,
hook, like you need a hook at the beginning. You need to hook the reader.
Yeah.
In the first paragraph. If you
Right.
don't, they're gonna put it down.
That's right.
and
Rule number one.
and you need and there's techniques about how you end the chapter, and
Yes.
so that it's a page turner in a sense, in some
Well,
sense.
maybe I should just
Fair.
read that book.
Well, you can borrow it from Janice. She has.
No, she said she wouldn't let go of it.
Okay. So we talked a little bit earlier about show, don't tell. Don't tell too much. Let the reader fill in the blanks. You know, I can almost tell when I go back to read a draft when I started hurrying because the exposition picks up, and after you write a while, you notice it in the people you read too. Even some best-selling authors, I can tell when they decided they were tired of this story. Let's get it over with. Go on to the next bestseller, and there's a big exposition dump. And sometimes it might go on for pages where they tell you everything that they think you need to know to finish the story. So it's obvious when you're reading, and so I have to be careful in going back and hurrying. If I'm trying to meet a deadline or trying to get a certain chapter finished, and I really don't spend as much time on it as I should, I start using more and more exposition. I start telling, and
Well, this is another one of those rules, but I see it broken all the time. And if you break a rule, you have to make it good.
yeah,
And some authors do make telling very good.
yes, of course they do. And I mean, not
But I-
everybody. I mean,
I think it just boils down to, instead of telling the reader that this boy is a bully, show him bullying.
Yeah.
Or if in descriptions, if a woman has on a long full skirt, rather than saying she has a long full skirt, tell about it, how it swishes when she walks, you know?
catches on a hook if she goes through the door. Or
Well, and
the guy she's dancing with steps on her skirt. I mean, there's all sorts of ways you can do that. Yeah.
Right.
So,
Uh,
so
one of the things I'm looking at my watch.
Yeah.
One of the I think interesting things was, and you may have added this, to talk about when you should edit and when you and I think that would be an interesting thing. And I do think that often the flow or the rhythm of the piece is lost if you stop and begin to go back and edit. But if you can move all the way through and really let it flow and then go back, I have found, and then go back. And of course, this is with, I guess, a short story more than a novel. I can't speak to that. Never tried
well,
a novel,
true.
but
It's true for writing a chapter. That's what I do.
yeah, and then go back.
Each chapter.
So I think it gets really, you can lose the rhythm if you stop and edit too soon.
well, there's some very well-known, very good writers who take several weeks to write a page or write a page and a half, and that's I mean, that's admirable, and their writing is beautiful. They get out one book every 15 or 20 years. And I can't do that. But I do resist the temptation to go back from the beginning and read everything that I've done up when I'm before I'm done with the first draft. What my practice is to read what I did yesterday, and then correct the obvious things in that, and then try to write that many pages again today. But everybody does it differently.
Right.
Do
Go
you
ahead.
have a special time, Boyd, for writing? Do you, in your day? Is it
I
usually in the
try
morning?
to write first thing in the morning, and I can do it for a couple. If I keep to my schedule, I can write for 2 or 3 hours. That's about my limit. What about you, Janice?
In the morning, I write, and even though nothing comes, you have to sit there because, as Picasso said, inspiration comes, but it must find you working, and it does come when you're working.
Yeah.
But I find that I write a draft without worrying, and I write it in longhand on a tablet, a legal pad. And I don't worry about how good it is. I just write it through. But at the end of that chapter, I go back and put it on my computer, revise it, and then I go on to the next chapter. But I have to feel like the one that I just wrote is good enough to keep on writing this book. So I can't.
If you don't feel that way, you'll never finish the book.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
you really won't. So do you have a goal for a daily goal?
I do not.
Yeah.
I do not.
I don't either. I know people who write novels who want to do 2,000 words a day or
Yeah.
5 pages or something like. Sometimes I do tell myself, well, the thing is going to be 300 pages. If I just would write 10 pages a day, I'd finish it in 300 days. So.
Well, and when I'm writing a novel,
30 days.
I can only think, I'll have an outline of the whole thing, but I can only tell myself I'm writing one chapter or I'll be overwhelmed.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
One chapter at a time.
I think short stories are a different animal. And I enjoyed writing the short stories that I did for the Writer's Journal. And both of them were based on observances or knowledges of experiences of with a friend, and to take that little kernel of event and expand it to a short story, in a lot of ways it's a different kind of problem than you have with writing a novel, where you have room to let things expand over time. With a short story, you have to have so much that you don't say, or that you hint at, or that is expressed in a very pithy way, or by what you leave out, or what it's a different kind of problem than writing a longer piece.
Kim, I'm interested to hear about you. It sounds like you and I are we I think write more briefly. Maybe you have done a novel, but I never have attempted it. And I wonder, I don't have any special time. I'm not a pro, so I don't set aside a time. I never have liked to do any of that. Even when I painted, I never did like to have a certain time when I did. I just
when the light was better or anything like that.
Yeah. Well.
So
yeah.
Jim, are you writing anything now?
No, not right now. I hate to admit that. Damn you for asking me. No,
Writers are notorious liars. Go ahead and say.
I think I told you this one time, right after I quit practicing law, I wrote a novel that was a complete novel. It's all done. It's all been edited, and all kinds of things have been done, but it's in manuscript. I have never submitted it anywhere because when I tried to get an agent, I ran into zero, I mean, nobody would talk to me about it. And same thing with contacting publishers directly, those that you can. They said, don't call us, we'll call you. We don't want to see it. So it's in my closet. I suppose that would be my work in progress if I were doing anything on it. But unless something comes to mind that I want to do, it's done and finished. And I hope someday it'll be published, and probably it will, but it'll probably be self-published.
Well, the problem of finding an outlet for your work, finding an agent, finding a publisher, we could spend an entire session on. It's really, really changed out there, and it's a difficult landscape because there's so many books published every day. I think it was something like 3,000 new books a day, something like that. And finding an audience is a real challenge for everybody. But
It's getting more and more so.
yeah.
As publishers join each other and have big conglomerates, the main thing is the bottom line.
So the people who write who have written a bestseller are the ones that the publishers want to write the second bestseller, looking for that.
But there are small publishers
Yeah.
that not only will they be more likely to publish your book, they will keep it in print. Where some publisher like Random House, after a year, they have other books coming on. It goes out of print.
Yeah. Well,
Now,
that's right.
also, there are niche publishers too. If you use a smaller publisher who maybe, for instance, my Hudson Bend and the Birth of Lake Travis was, I guess, memoir and history all mixed up. But this was a South Carolinian publisher, and they specialized in local histories. So that was a perfect fit.
Yeah, you have to research the publishers to see
Yeah.
what they
Yeah.
want.
Right.
So I think one thing that I would encourage everybody who's out there thinking about writing either a short or long piece of fiction is to finish that first draft, because until you've done that, until you've completed the story and you've seen how it began and ended and how it developed in between, it's just a work in progress. It's just an idea. It hadn't been finished. And once you have the first draft, then you can go back and do so much more with it. And I found that in the course of writing this last book, my ideas of some of the characters changed completely during the course of writing the book. And so I didn't stop at midway when I first saw that Joseph had different characteristics than I had given him in the beginning. I went on and let his character develop. And then when I had to go back and rewrite that first chapter or second chapter, it really wasn't that hard, because there were only a few places where I had a good editor, but there were only a few places where I had given him the objectionable traits or had talked about him in a way that wasn't consistent with the way it was there. So once you get that first draft complete, the revisions, it's not like you have to write it all over again.
I love doing revisions.
Yeah.
That's the real pleasure of writing for me.
Mm-hmm.
The hard part is the first draft.
That is the hard part. Yeah. Well, are we running out of time, timekeeper?
No, we've got about 5 minutes. Let me just say that when when you proposed this, I went to the dictionary and I looked up fiction, just to see what old Webster had to say about it. And I want to read it to you. It says, this is not it in entirety, but any literary work portraying imaginary characters and events as a novel, story, or play. Something accepted as fact for the sake of convenience, although not necessarily true. And then it went on and talked about fictionized, fictionist, and then fictioneer, which I said, oh, that's me. Listen
You're a
to this.
fictioneer?
It says a prolific writer of mediocre fiction. So I may be a fictioneer, but that doesn't stop me.
I never heard that word before in my
I
life.
think Webster coined it.
Probably.
So,
Okay.
thank you all. Any last word of advice?
Keep writing.
Yeah, just fill up that blank page
Right.
and
Right.
read.
Yes, and read, but don't steal.
But you have to read to be able to write.
I absolutely believe that's true. I absolutely believe that's true. Netflix has a interesting documentary about C.S. Lewis on now, and I recommend it to anybody because the twists and turns his life took as a writer, and how and his particularly his writing the Narnia books for children, and they go into that in a lot of detail. So I learned a lot about C.S. Lewis that I
And there's a book in the library about him. It's fiction, as it's writing about his wife.
Mhm.
He eventually married, and I've forgotten what the title of it is, but it's in the library, and you can look up
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis.
He married a couple of times. He married the first wife was 20 years his senior, and he was still a student at Oxford, so he had to introduce her as his mother. So it made it a little awkward. So that's off the subject. I'm sorry, listeners. One last word. If you have a story or a piece of a longer work, I encourage you to submit it to the next edition of the Westminster Writers Journal. We're going to be going out for submittals in February, and we'd like to see your work included. And I think it will give you some pleasure to see it there. If you have something for us, well, we certainly would like to have it.
And
So
if you
now,
have a memoir and you're a little bit embarrassed and you don't want to show off, or you don't want to, or there's something embarrassing about it, make it fiction. It doesn't have to change the names of everybody and make it fiction and tell us about it so we can be entertained.
all right, that's good advice.
Well, I'll be there.
So special thanks to our panelists, Janice and Carol and Bill. And thank you all for watching. Stay safe and
Thank you.
stay well.
Thank you, Ed. Enjoy it.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Let's see if- Stop recording.